If you don't prep your soil, your spring garden could suffer. So today I'm going to show you exactly how I'm prepping my beds to make sure that they have the best chance of producing the highest yield. So today we're going to be talking about all the different ways that you can feed your plants, and we're going to start with amendments. Then we're going to move on to fertilizers, compost, and organic mulches. These are all ways to prepare your beds, feed your soil, feed your plants. So let's start with amendments first. Amendments are interesting. I used to think that, fertilizer was the only way to go. Like you just fertilize your plants. That's all you need to do. And then I kind of got into the world of amendments, and I started using these more than fertilizer for a number of reasons. One, per weight, amendments tend to be cheaper. I also noticed that the overall health of the soil improves dramatically using amendments versus just using fertilizer. Because fertilizer there's organic fertilizers that feed the soil as well as the plants, but the amendments really feed the soil. I mean, they're just feeding the soil, and then the soil produces and feeds the plants. It's just a different kind of cycle or stage. There's nothing wrong with one way or the other. I mean, both ways work, but I have noticed that I spend a lot less time fertilizing and a lot higher productivity when I go the amendment route. That's why I wanted to start with these first. Let's talk about each one of the four that I use. So the first one here is worm castings. I don't use this one as much as I used to use it, mainly because when I dig into my beds now, there's so many worms and bugs and all kinds of gross stuff in there that I don't really need it. Worm castings is just worm poop or excrement. And if I have worms in the bed, they're producing this, so it's not always necessary for me to do worm castings. But I wanted to show it because I think it's important that for those who are newer gardeners, beginner gardeners, maybe you have a brand new bed, maybe you've been gardening for years and you're getting into raised bed gardening or in-ground gardening, and your soil doesn't have all of those bugs yet, like all those worms and beautiful bugs. So adding this is kind of like a shortcut. So you're basically putting in their poop without having to have the worms there. Once you have the worms in your bed, I'm not really sure that this is as helpful. They're kind of doing their job naturally. You don't necessarily need this anymore. But if you're first starting out, this is really good. One of the best things that my plants love is the excrement of the bugs. So the worm poop or castings, they adore it, absolutely adore it. All plants love it. If you're growing in pots and you don't necessarily have a lot of worms in your pots, this is a good thing to add to it. And you almost can't overdo it. Worm castings is just one of those things that I feel like you could put 5 pounds into a pot and it's not gonna burn the plants. None of these really are going to burn your plants. Maybe this guy a little bit, but amendments, it's really easy to not hurt your soil, not hurt your plants, because they break down over time, and because they're feeding the soil, it's like this slow feed that it just generally doesn't have any negative effects. Of course, you do want to follow the directions as best as you can. But first ones being worm castings, really good, especially for those beginner gardeners or new soils, new plots, new pots. The next one I adore is blood meal. I bought a lot of different types. This is down to earth, but Espuma has some. I mean, there's some that you can get on Amazon that are no name that you just buy from a manufacturer. All of them work. They're pretty much all the same. I don't really get too fussy about it. I kind of look at whichever one's on sale that week that I'm buying it, and I go from there. Blood meal is probably one of the more expensive ones and one that I use the most often. So that's one of the downsides of it, of course, being my favorite, is that it is the most expensive one. Now, what blood meal does is blood meal has a 1200 NPK. The first number of that is nitrogen. The nitrogen is 12. It's one of the highest numbers that you can get in an organic fertilizer or amendment. You can find some, I think there's a couple other ones. I want to say feather meal might be higher, but blood meal is one of the highest. And it is a great way to add nitrogen to your soil without adding anything else. And that's important for me. If you were around last fall, I did a soil test and my phosphorus and potassium were off the charts. I mean, very high. So I don't want to add any more phosphorus or potassium, but I do need to add nitrogen. Nitrogen is one of those things, it seeps out really quick. When we start getting our rains during the summer, it really seeps out. So it's really important that you're putting a nitrogen source into your garden at least 2 times a year, right? So right when we end our fertilizer ban, so here in Florida, we have a fertilizer ban around summer because when the rains are coming, it's washing everything out. So you'll put something down and it just washes it right out, and it washes out into our waterways, and it's not really good for our drinking water, for red tide, all kinds of stuff. So we don't do it during the summer, which is probably the time it needs it the most, but it is what it is. What we do is we do it right when that fertilizer ban ends. I think that is, I want to say like October-ish. So as you're preparing for your fall garden, that's when you're going to put this down. And then I usually do another round right now. So after I've grown my fall garden and my winter garden, I'm putting my nitrogen down for my spring garden. And some of it will feed over until summer, until that rain starts, and basically it goes away after that. Now, I'm going to be adding, usually what I do, what is this, a raised cup? Yeah, this is a Tampa Bay raised cup. So one of those cups that you get from, watching a game. I don't know, is this like 36 ounces? What is this? Yeah, I don't know, but based on this size, if I fill this cup all the way up, it equals 1 pound generally. And that's, for bone meal, blood meal, all these things right here. So usually what I do when I'm using the blood meal or the bone meal or kelp or the worm castings is I will fill this cup all the way up and I will spread it across 3 beds. So since I'm only doing 1 bed today, I'm only filling this cup about 1/3 of the way up. And that should give me that, third that I need for that bed. Otherwise, if you're doing more than 1 bed, like I said, one of these big cups like this is 3 beds. Or if you have a kitchen scale, and obviously you don't have one of these cups because I know they're not universal, is you can use a kitchen scale to measure it, and you can measure a pound. The other option, if you don't have a kitchen scale, you don't have one of these cups, is you come and you look at this box. This box is 4 pounds. So if I wanted 1 pound, which would equal 1 of these cups, it would be 1/4 of this box. So pull the bag out, pull out about 1/4. It doesn't have to be perfect, guys. Amendments are very forgiving. But pull out about 1/4 of this box, that equals 1 pound. 1 pound or 1 cup spreads across 3 beds. Sorry, I'm repeating that a lot, but I'm trying to make sure that you're aware of how much you need to use. I think people tend to either underuse or overuse. And if you overuse, you're wasting money, right? Because the garden's only going to take up so much. And then if you run into the rainy season after you've overused, you're going to be contributing to, the pollution of our waterways. So I want to make sure that you're using the proper amounts. Now, same idea, same concept is going to be bone meal. Now this one actually does still have some nitrogen. I don't know if you can see that, but it's basically a 4-12-0. So it's got 4% nitrogen, then it's got 12 phosphorus and 0 potassium. Sorry, I always do the phosphorus and potassium backwards. So it has the highest amount of phosphorus. Now phosphorus is really good for your fruiting plants, your root crops. It's really good to help maintain the health of the roots, as well as encouraging the flowering that's needed for things like tomatoes. Phosphorus is really important. What's cool about this one is this one actually has a 12% calcium as well. For those of you who have tomatoes and maybe you've had a lot of blossom end rot, this is going to help with that as well. And you're going to do the same thing. It's 1/3 of a cup for 1 bed, or 3 beds for a full cup, aka a pound. This is a powdery substance, so be very careful when using this because it kind of it blows up in the air and you don't want to necessarily breathe it, because bone meal is made from bones, just like blood meal is made from blood. These are byproducts of slaughterhouses. The last one, and I'm sorry I don't have the box anymore. I got this from Down to Earth as well. It was in a box like this. This is kelp meal. I'm sorry, I also don't remember what the numbers of nitrogens were. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, but I do know that it has very little nitrogen, very little phosphorus, and what it has a majority of in kelp meal is potassium. Potassium is one of those that you really probably don't have a deficiency in. There's very few soils that I have seen that has that deficiency, but if you do, you can add kelp meal, and that's a good amendment to add to encourage that. Or if you're starting a brand new bed with fresh, soil, you can add, same thing, 1/3 of a cup for one bed. And a bed, sorry, I forgot to mention this earlier, a bed is 8 by 4 feet. That's what my beds are, and that's how I spread this out across them. So if you have a smaller bed, account for that when you're spreading it out. Kelp meal is going to be the potassium side of it. So when we talk about NPK on those numbers on the front, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and kelp meal being the potassium. So the only way you're gonna know if you need any of these things, or if your soil is depleted in any of these, is to do a soil test. I actually did a video, I'll put it down in the description at the end of this video to show you how I went about doing my soil test. You could use the Epic Gardening soil test that I used. You can also reach out to your county extension office, and they have tests there. They tend to be a little bit cheaper, but I feel like the results and the data you get from Epic Gardening is much more easier to comprehend and understand what needs to be done, versus the county extension's office are more scientific, so they're a little bit harder to read, and the process to submit them is a bit different, where Epic Gardening is just a little bit easier. But you're going to be paying for that easier and that easy to understand and easy to ship and all those things. You pay a little bit more for the Epic Gardening than you would for the extension office one. So up to you guys. But I strongly encourage you to soil test. It took me many years before I ever started soil testing, and I wish I would have done it sooner, because I didn't realize how much phosphorus was in my soil. It was too much, to the point that it could be damaging my plants. So I wish I would have done it earlier. I kept thinking that the flowering problem that I was having with some of my plants and my tomatoes was because I didn't have enough phosphorus, just based on the way that the plants were behaving, right? If they're not flowering good, that probably means they don't have phosphorus. That was actually not the case. I think it's the reverse. If you give them too much phosphorus, then you end up with a flowering problem as well. So it's one of those things that until you test the soil, you're not 100% sure. You can go off of some ideas, right? If you see your greens, like your lettuces and your broccolis, turning yellow, I mean, it's more likely than not you don't have enough blood meal or nitrogen. If you see that your tomato plants aren't flowering very well, but they're growing lots of greens, you probably means your phosphorus isn't high enough. Probably. And if your overall plants are all just dying across the board, maybe you don't have any potassium. Maybe your pH is way off, and you have to add lime, or you have to add sulfur or something like that. Like, there's ways to kind of guess, but the only way to be sure is a soil test, and it's huge. It's so helpful. I'm gonna get off that soapbox and let's go put this in the bed. I'm gonna show you how we actually add this to the bed. I'm not adding the kelp or the bone meal or this guy to this particular bed. It has worms, it has plenty of potassium, it has plenty of phosphorus. So we're just going with the nitrogen source. All right, now it's just as simple as sprinkling it. And a couple of tips is, don't do like I did and do it way up here. It was mainly just for the video so you could see it. Do it closer, so that when the wind blows, it's not having so far to travel, because it blows off and it blows out into the yard, and then you're wasting money. Doesn't hurt the yard. But the other thing is you want to rake it in. So that's all you need to do to rake it in. It also helps to water it. So especially on a really dry or windy day, if you put it down, it doesn't hurt to just a thin layer of water across it, makes it kind of heavy, makes it stick. If you wanted to add mulch on top of it too, that's a great idea as well. Anything to kind of hold it in place, because it is kind of dusty, so it will just blow off if you don't give it some way to hold on to the ground. Now the next amendment is going to be compost, and I hate to even admit this, but I waited way too long to get into compost, mainly because compost just seemed kind of messy and dirty, and where do you put that when you have kind of a small suburban lot? Is it going to smell? Is it going to attract animals? I was really worried about a lot of these things. And I have fruit trees that attract animals, like rats, squirrels, Yeah, they like the fruit trees. They pay absolutely no mind to the compost bin. I think it's because I went with tumblers. Tumblers are enclosed, so there's no actual way for them to get in here, and it's really thick plastic, so it's really hard for them to like chew through it. I also have a dog that absolutely loves to chase squirrels and rats, so we tend not to have too much of a problem with that, including the fence, even though they can get over all that stuff. They can get through all of that if they really want to, but they don't mess with this. Does it give bugs? That's always a really big question. Yeah, but the bugs stay in there. The bugs really want to be in the compost tumblers because that's their job, is to break down the food and the brown materials and all that fun stuff that's in there is like their food source, and they absolutely love it. But yeah, it's a little jarring when you open it up to add something to it, or you go to turn it and like bugs fly out. It's a little jarring. You tend to get used to it over time. There's worms, there's bugs, there's palmetto bugs in there. It's super gross, but when it's done, there are no more bugs. I don't know if their life cycle ends and they're dead, or if they leave. I'm not really sure how they come and how they go. I've never been able to observe that, but when the compost is done, there's not really like bugs in there anymore. So I don't know if that helps. Now, how do you do compost, right? I have a great video on lazy composting, like how to get this started without doing all that scientific mathematical calculations and stuff. You chuck a bunch of brown material in. Brown material is basically dead material, right? So wood chips, paper products, cardboard, dead leaves, that's all brown material. Sawdust, like if you or your husband are into like building stuff and you got a lot of sawdust on your workstation, you can put that in here. Now to that, you want to add green materials, and so I add about a half of this tumbler full of the brown material, and then I just slowly start adding the green material. Green material is going to be things like grass clippings, fresh grass clippings, food waste, you know, your vegetable scraps, maybe like rice, you know, anything that you didn't eat. Now the things you want to kind of avoid are going to be things that are oily or buttery, or anything that has meat. Some people still do compost meat. I personally don't. If I had like a large compost pile, I might, because it gets to hot composting. Tumblers aren't going to do hot composting. They're going to do more like vermicomposting, which is just bugs breaking it down. And without that heat, I'm not 100% sure that the bacteria from the food, I don't know. I try to stay away from it. Some people say don't put citrus peels in here. I do. Some people say don't put eggshells unless you bake them and crush them. I do. I mean, some people say that you should shred every piece of item that goes in here, whether it's food or paper. I don't. I have chucked an entire watermelon in here that had bug damage that we weren't going to be able to eat because it started to rot and I didn't notice it. It was a large size watermelon, and I wedged that thing in there and just dropped it in. Broke down, no problem. Yes, it will take a little bit longer to break down, but it wasn't really noticeable to me. So I just keep adding those green materials. Like I said, the food waste, the grass clippings, what's another good one? Oh, manures. If you have animals like chickens, rabbits, any kind of like cow, horse, any kind of, I think it's a herbivore type animal, so one that doesn't eat meat, you don't want to use your dog or your cat's feces because they consume meat, and meat can have like bacterial situations going on. So you want herbivore animals, animals that eat grass, vegetables, those kinds of things. You can add that as a green material as well. And I just slowly add that, and then I start tumbling it. I try every time I walk by here to tumble it. Usually I get to tumbling about once a week. But even if you didn't tumble, it will still break down. It takes longer to break down if you don't tumble because you want to create some aeration in there. But it depends on the time of year. If it's dead of summer and it is blazing hot and there's a ton of bugs out, I can get a compost tumbler done in about 3 months. But if it's winter, like it is right now, it takes a lot longer. I mean, this has been sitting in here since before I left on my vacation in October, and it's still not completely broken down. Now, it doesn't help that I just keep adding stuff to it. I also add like my garden debris. I forgot to mention that. Like if you're pulling your plants and it's like your pea vines or your broccolis or your cauliflowers, you're not going to consume the leaves, although you can, but say you're not going to, you can tuck all that in here and it will break down. It'll behave as green material. Now, the weird thing is that when compost breaks down, it becomes smaller. So you'll fill this thing all the way up, you'll tumble it, and like 4 weeks later, it's down to half. And then you add some more stuff, tumble it, and then 4 weeks later, it's back down to half. It keeps like consuming it, and then it makes the compost smaller. So I just keep adding all throughout winter. And then when it starts to heat up and I start to see it really starting to change and not be solid pieces. So when you're looking at the compost and you're tumbling it, take a peek at it. Do you see anything that's recognizable? You know, like a food scrap or a piece of paper from your shredded paper. If you see those little distinguishable pieces, it's not even close. But when you start to not be able to distinguish it, or there's only a few items that you can tell what they are, you're getting closer. Stop adding to it at that point and just tumble it, you know, once a week. And then when it gets to the point that there are no distinguishable pieces, with the exception of like eggshells. Eggshells take forever to break down, so I don't necessarily worry about those if I see those. But once I get to that point, I'll usually pull it out. Where I live, the humidity and the moisture in the air is so high that my compost never actually looks like the compost that you see on other YouTube videos where it's like crumbly and beautiful and all that things. Mine's like clumpy. It's so wet. It's because of all the moisture. I add no water to my compost. People say, oh, you're probably adding too much water. I don't add any water. I add 0 water. If it looked like it wasn't wet enough, I would, but I've never had that happen here in Florida. The wetness from the food that's getting added or the plants that's getting added, along with all our humidity and rain, I never have a problem with this having, you know, not enough water. I have the reverse. It has too much water and there's nothing I can really do about it. Sometimes I'll crack it open to let it kind of air out, but it's really moist in there. So I will dump it out onto a tarp and I will lay it out for a day and kind of try to let it dry a little bit before I try to crumple it with my hands. And that usually works for me. I wanted to make that a point just because I know that there are several Florida gardeners that watch my channel that probably are wondering why their compost doesn't look like the compost that you see online. The clumpy compost is, I think it's our climate. I think it's our rain. I think it's our humidity. It doesn't get to that soft stage. Now, if it wasn't in a tumbler and it was just a pile, I think maybe I would have the compost look like it's supposed to because it has more area to like air out, where this is like confined in here. So there's a lot of pros and cons. Once again, I have a whole nother video on the pros and cons of whether to use a tumbler or whether to use a pile. You can check all that out. I'm going to put that all in the description for you. When you're ready to use your compost and it's done, the easiest thing to do is just to lay it on your bed. One of these tumblers generally gets me one bed, 8 by 4 foot bed. So I kind of rotate between my beds of adding the compost to the beds. So I start out in, you know, the first 2 batches that I make, I put them on my bed 1 and 2, and then the next 2 batches I make goes to 3 and 4. You really only need to add compost to your beds once a year. So by the time I get through a year, I should be able to cover most of my beds with this compost. Homemade compost is so much better than the store stuff. I feel like the store stuff just doesn't have very much nutrients. Homemade compost has a ridiculous amount of nutrients. You don't even need a lot to put it in your bed. Take this, which would equal, when I pull all this out, it kind of fills up a 5-gallon bucket, and I take that 5-gallon bucket and I spread it across one whole bed. You could spread it across 2 beds. You might be thinning it out a little bit much, but there's a lot of nutrients in here, so it probably would be okay. But really what I equal 1 full bin, which usually equals 1 5-gallon bucket full, heads to one of my beds. The next section is going to be fertilizer, and I have a lot of different kinds here. You don't really need this many. I just kind of have bought a lot through the years. Like, you guys have given me recommendations and I've kind of tried them all. And the long and short is they all kind of work the same. I haven't really found one that I absolutely love more than another, with the exception of the liquid fertilizers. We'll talk about those in a second. There are some liquid fertilizers that I prefer more than others, but from a granular fertilizer type, man, there's so many. They come in basically 2 ways, right? So there are liquid fertilizers and granular fertilizers. Within that, you have organic and synthetic, right? And within that, you have fruit ones, and vegetable ones. Let's break this down a little bit. So let's first talk about liquid versus granular. Granular is good because granular is very similar to the amendments. It breaks down over time. It takes a little while. It's not like immediately available. So if your plants are suffering, granular isn't necessarily going to fix their problem quickly. Liquid will, because it is more readily available to the plants. But the granular feeds over a longer period of time. So just like right now where I put down that blood meal, if I wanted to use a granular fertilizer, which I don't really need right now because like I said, my soil test is telling me I just need nitrogen. So that's all I need to add. But if I had like all kinds of problems, all nitrogen deficiency, phosphorus deficiency, potassium deficiency, the best way to go is with a granular fertilizer. You spread it across your bed according to the package instructions. These you want to be a little bit more specific on, following the directions of how much to apply. You add this to the bed and you don't need to do it but once every like 3 months. It is really, you don't have to. Some say to do it monthly, but I've found that like 3 months is really the magic number how often you have to add it. So you don't have to be out there fertilizing your plants every single week. Now with a liquid fertilizer, it is more readily available to the plants. The plants that are suffering really should get the liquid fertilizer so they can get fed immediately, and then you put the granular down with it. You put both of them down. So this feeds them for 3 months, this feeds them for the next couple weeks until this starts to break down and it's available to them. So liquid fertilizers are great for that purpose if you're having a problem. And generally what I do is I would put down my amendments or the fertilizer into the beds at the beginning of the season. And then if I see that 1 or 2 plants are having a problem, that's when I move to my liquid fertilizers. Now when it comes to the granulars, there's so many kinds. There's Espuma, Down to Earth, Dr. Earth, Nutri-Rich, like I've tried them all. I've tried Miracle Grow, I've tried all kinds of stuff, guys. And I like this one. The Dr. Earth is pretty good. Just with the way that it sticks to the soil. But if you want to talk about price, Nutri-Rich is probably the most cost-effective one. And when you have a large garden and you have to fertilize a lot of stuff, you know, this is expensive. This is cheap. And this is just granulated chicken manure. I get this from Azure Standard. I'm not sure if it's sold anywhere else, but you can sign up for Azure and you can buy this from them, and then you go through the delivery process. It's an interesting process just to prepare you for that. But it's cheap, and so you can buy very large amounts and keep it for years. The liquids, I like either Neptune's Harvest or Alaska's Fish Fertilizer. Currently, I'm not using either one of these because, like I said, phosphorus and potassium are high in my garden, so I don't need either one of these because they have phosphorus and potassium. This one, this Rose and Flowering, is a 264, so that means it has nitrogen and phosphorus, and this one is a 131, which not quite as bad if I felt like my tomatoes needed it, but I can't imagine that they will. What I like to use is the Alaska Fish Fertilizer. I don't have any right now. I actually went through it and I'm waiting on a shipment for it, but that one has a high nitrogen. It's a 511, so it has 5 nitrogen, 1 phosphorus, 1 potassium. So the lowest amount that I could find in a liquid fertilizer that has the highest nitrogen is Alaska's Fish Fertilizer. I like those. These stink. All of these smell awful, but these stink really bad. They smell like kind of rotten fish. It's really gross. But the plants love it. I have found that plants are just gross. Like what they like to eat is just disgusting. Rotting garbage, dead plant, dead fish, and then like animal poop. It's like the worst diet ever. But they love it. It smells. So I would not necessarily encourage you to be using these products if you have indoor house plants. It's gonna make your house stink. It makes my garden stink for a few hours, and then it kind of settles down and the smell goes away. Within a day, the smell does go away. If your smell is not going away within a day, I would strongly encourage you to check your ratios. Make sure that you're using the right amount. This doesn't require much. You mix I think it's like 1 ounce, which is basically a tablespoon, I think, with like a gallon of water. Read the instructions. Each one is a little bit different. This, you lay it down just like we did the amendment, just like the blood meal. But there are different measurements. You're not using that 1/3 of a pound situation. You use a lot less of this. Then you have your fruit stuff. I only use 2 fruit fertilizers. I use Berrytone. I use Berrytone for berries, blueberries, blackberries, strawberries, Indian berries, like any elderberries. I use this one. I usually use Job's fruit and citrus, but for some reason I got confused and I ordered this. And it's a synthetic fertilizer. I don't particularly like using synthetic fertilizers. I do want to go strictly organic, but I had it and I had started using it before my mind clicked and realized that it wasn't Job's. They're kind of similar in color, so it kind of threw me off. And I only use it like twice a year. So I'm only pulling this thing out twice a year. So I didn't realize it when I got it. But if you're okay with synthetic, this one works pretty well. In fact, I think it works better than Job's, but it's not organic. So that's something to consider. It does have, you know, kind of that lower numbers that an organic would. I think that's another reason why it threw me off, is it's like a 646, which traditionally when you're looking at organic fertilizers, they have the lower numbers, and the synthetic fertilizers have like these super high double digit numbers, like 15, 15, 15, 20, 20, 20, you know, 1, 64, 5. It's crazy. It's because, you know, it's synthetic. They make it to be the numbers that they want it to be. So this one is pretty good, I'm not gonna lie. I'm not a big fan of synthetics, but it is working out pretty well, and I am gonna go ahead and use the bag. I am not like super strict in my garden. I do want, you know, I haven't used a synthetic fertilizer in the vegetable garden in probably 4 years. The last time I used it was when I was growing corn, because corn tends to be one of those that I just can't feed it enough organic fertilizers for it to work. I have to move to the higher numbers to get corn to grow. But the fruit trees had never had a touch of synthetic fertilizer, and of course I got this, and I'm like, okay, well, I guess we're going with it. I don't hang up too much on that kind of stuff. If I feel like it's a decent brand, if I'm okay with it, I just roll with it, guys. It's totally up to you. It's your garden, it's your choices. But the fruit fertilizers are very specific to fruit. Like this one, the berry tone, tends to have more of the things that the berries need to flower, as well as some of the soil acidifying properties, because a lot of berries tend to like soil that's more acidic. Another thing, that the fruit, this one is a citrus and avocado, although I'm using it across all of my plants. It's going on the peaches, it's going on the avocado, it's going on the mulberries, it goes on everything. It's going on the figs, all of it. I don't really necessarily worry that much about whether it's for a specific fruit. These are the only two that I specify the fruits. So when the berry stuff is because it needs a little bit more acidity, so I focus on a fertilizer that's meant for them because it will add a little bit more acidity to the soil, whereas the fruit fertilizer is not going to do that. It's more meant for all the other fruits. I give this to bananas too. So all that to tell you this: buy one granular, buy one liquid. And if it was my recommendation, I would say get the Nutri-Rich for your granular fertilizer, get the Neptune's Harvest tomato and veg for your liquid fertilizer, and get your Job's citrus and fruit fertilizer. It's not here, but that's the one that I would definitely recommend for those 3 different items. Let's fertilize these together, and I'm gonna share with you like when you need to fertilize. So when I look at this tree, I can see that it's starting to break buds. They're like coming out, and the very tips of them are like a little bit green, like a tiny bit green. That tells me it's time to fertilize this. So I fertilize once in spring and once in like early summer. So right when the buds form, and then when the fruit is like medium size, I fertilize again. I'm just giving it the food it needs to produce the highest amount of fruit possible, and then it sits the rest of the year. Now, if your tree is struggling, you could maybe do a small application in fall, but I personally found like once they're in the ground for over a year, like you don't have to do that anymore. They don't really need it. So this is what I'm gonna use. You should measure, but I've done this enough time to kind of know. They don't really require a lot. It's just like a thin sprinkling. So basically 1 cup fed all of my trees. So you can see it's gonna take me a while to go through this fertilizer, but let's do the berries next. So I've got strawberries that I already went and fertilized when I planted them, but this entire row on this side right here is all different kinds of berries. On a side note, don't use your hands. It's not a good idea. It's gonna make your hands itch. I definitely wouldn't use my hands if I was using synthetic fertilizer. Veritone is organic, so I kind of know what's in there, but still, it's a good practice. Don't use your hands, or at least put a glove on. Do as I say, not as I do. I think that's the saying. Sorry. The last way to feed your plants are organic mulches. And there's a lot of different organic mulches. I'll tell you some of the ones that I really like. So small wood chips, not the wood chips that you buy at like a big box store where they're like rubber or they're like pine bark nuggets, not like those really big ones. You want like natural fine wood chips. Best place to get them is either from your county, chip drop, or talk to a tree service in your area, see if they can drop some off, or you can go pick some up. It is by far the very best mulch. The second best for me is going to be leaves, dried dead leaves. I collect mine in fall, and that's generally what I use. I was not here this fall, so I am like, my beds are not very mulched right now, which is driving me a little bit crazy. I've got to figure this out. Dead leaves are a really great one. They're kind of bulky and chunky. A lot of people say you should mow them down before you put them in. I never have, and it's always been fine. They do get a little bit matty or whatever, but as long as it's around the plants, it's fine. The last one has its pros and cons, which is going to be grass clippings. I personally love grass clippings, but there is a lot of prerequisites to using grass clippings. You want to use grass clippings that are just grass, no weeds, right? But then you also have to make sure that there's no herbicides. So if somebody has a beautiful lawn and they're like willing to give you their grass clippings, is it beautiful because they have no weeds, or is it beautiful because they use herbicide? The last thing you want to do is stick grass clippings with herbicide in your bed. It's going to kill everything. Everything. So you just have to be really selective. And you don't want grass with weeds in it, because the weeds have weed seeds and they're just going to pop up in your bed. But here's the pro. Grass clippings create like this really thick, matted, gelatinous, really gross layer mat, which is phenomenal in the dead of summer here in Florida. The rain comes down and it seeps through that mat, and that mat is like so thick it basically blocks that evaporation. And so I generally, when I use grass clippings during the summer, I almost have to use no extra watering, like one time a week, which is shocking. I know none of you guys are going to believe me, I know, but it's true. If I use grass clippings and I use a nice thick, 4 to 5 inches of grass clippings, they won't need as much water. It's really wild. And if you dig down in there, it's like wet. It is wet. So during the summer, I'll use grass clippings. During the winter, I don't use them because it does trap too much, and the air does need a chance to like kind of breathe and stuff. So usually I'll put it down in the summer. I'll let that stuff kind of naturally break down, and then I'll add leaves or wood chips. That's generally what I do. If you have no options for these natural ones, your other option is to take the debris from your plants. Like these peas behind me right here. Lots of vines. And when they're drying out, here's an example. I use peas in this garlic bed right here. And you can kind of see that they're breaking down now. And they create a nice cover, but they also kind of give like this straw-like texture, which is another good option for mulching. So using plant debris is a really great way to mulch. It's going to look a little kind of nasty. It's going to look a little dirty. Like they didn't look really pretty, right? It doesn't look like perfectly colored mulch or anything, but it does the job. And the cool thing about using pea plants is they have nitrogen fixing elements, and you're just basically putting the whole plant back in the garden, which is really cool. You could even take like your broccoli plants and chop up the leaves a little bit and sprinkle those around. Like you can really use the plant debris to feed or to mulch your beds, which is really cool. If you don't want to do that, if you want a more aesthetic looking garden and you can't get those natural mulches, your other option is going to be straw, pine shavings, pine bark, cypress mulch, what's another one? Hay, like all of those. So all of them have their pros and cons, like the pine bark mulch, pine in general, pine bark mulch, nuggets, pine shavings, pine needles, they all are slightly acidic. So they're going to cause some acidity in your beds. For me, that's not a big deal because mine kind of border on the alkaline in terms of my soil pH. So I don't mind that so much. But if you've been struggling with keeping your pH high enough, maybe it's been dropping too low, you may want to avoid those. Now they generally don't break down super fast and they're kind of on the top. So it's not always like it's going to like greatly affect it, but they are acidic. So that could be a problem. With the mulches, like the cypress mulches, generally when you buy them at the store, they're like big, huge pieces. And that's okay, but it's good for like keeping the water in the beds, stopping evaporation. What it's not good at is breaking down to feed the soil. And if your goal in mulching is not only water evaporation, but feeding the soil, those things take years. I have some in the front yard that we had bought the house with that we've been living here, I think like 4 or 5 years now. And that stuff has not broken down. It's still the same exact size. I pulled up one the other day, it was this big, and it's still huge. They just don't break down. So if they're not breaking down, they're not feeding the garden. So that's one thing to think about when you look at those big mulches. And anything above that is too big. That's what I'm talking about. That is too big. When I get wood mulch, I scoop it up with your hands, it can kind of fall through your fingers. That's the kind of size you're looking for it to break down quickly. Straw and hay, I almost mixed those together. Straw and hay, there's always some concern with straw and hay, especially if you don't know the source of your straw and hay. Straw can have weed seeds in it, or it can have the reverse problem. It's kind of like grass, guys. Straw and grass kind of have that same problem, right? You could have weed seeds, or you could have herbicide, because they commonly use herbicide to spray the field so that they don't get weeds and that they can just grow the hay or the straw. And that can, once again, kill all your plants. So if you ever put one of those down in your garden and then your garden all died, that might be why. It might be because there's herbicide in it. And that is like such a heartbreaking thing because it takes so long to get the herbicide to come out. It is really hard to grow in those soils. You can still grow things. There's actually plants that will grow with herbicide in the soil. It's going to be grass plants. Think like corn. What else? Like your grains, like rice, wheat, rye, barley, sesame seed. Like there's the grain or what we call grass plants, grass crops. Those will grow. It's actually what they're designed for. Herbicide is designed to kill other plants and leave those types of grass plants alone. So that's something to think about. So that's why I take the extra step and I go out and I search for wood chips, or I search for good grass, or I search for dead leaves in people's yards that I know don't spray stuff. Your other option, and one that I absolutely love, is I have a small wood chipper. It's a little home wood chipper, really super tiny. And I use that, like when I prune my fruit trees, I will chip up all the branches from my fruit trees, prunings. Or like we have a bunch of dead perennials up front because we had that bad cold front and it killed a bunch of our perennials. Not killed, they're still alive underground, they'll resprout, but I've got to cut all the tops of everything off. That's going to create a lot of wood material for me, and I have this home wood mulcher, and I just pull that out and I spend a couple hours just mulching up that wood. That is the best. It is the best. It's a lot of work. It takes some effort, it takes some work. But the mulch is going to be feeding these beds. It's basically like composting in place, but with the wood or the brown materials. Grass clippings is more like green materials. Plant debris is more like green materials, but you're basically composting in place. And the plants absolutely love it for so many reasons. I can't encourage you more to definitely go with some organic mulches. All the products you saw today, all the products I talked about, I'm going to put down into the description. They're also in my Amazon store, so if you want to pick any of these up for your garden, make sure to check that out. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today and talking all about how to feed our plants. Happy gardening, guys.